Get out the crane, construction time again. What is it this time? Hi guys, and welcome to Piano and Keyboard Artist, the channel where we discuss the artists related to pianos, keyboards and synthesizers. And continuing with my Depeche Mode album review series, today we're talking about Construction Time Again. Construction Time Again was released on the 22nd of August 1983, and it was Depeche Mode's third studio album, Martin Gore's second album as a songwriter, and new member Alan Wilder had just joined the band. Of course, at this point, Alan Wilder had replaced Vince Clarke and come in as a session musician, and Alan Wilder did get to a point where he said, "Hey guys, am I part of this band or not?" I think the band were a little bit intimidated by him, by the fact that he was such a great musician, but they were only paying him, I think, at about £100 a week at the time. Alan did get to a point where he said, "Okay guys, am I part of this band or not?" And the rest is history. So they went into the studio and did the first single with Alan Wilder, which was Get the Balance Right. And Get the Balance Right was kind of like an interim single. You know, it's a single, so it doesn't really fit on a broken frame, and it doesn't really fit on that well on Construction Time Again either. But it was a necessary single at the time. The band have got mixed reviews on it. You know, it's one of those songs, like It's Called a Heart. I think Martin Gore says, you know, it's not one of their best songs. But in retrospect, as Martin Gore said, that had they not released that song, had they gone back and changed history and not released that song, you know, things could have turned out differently. So you've got to sometimes look back in life, and the choices you make, even though you're quite embarrassed about them, sometimes in hindsight and in the grand scheme of things, they turn out to be the right decision. Get the Balance Right was the first single that Alan Wilder was involved with, and it did have a very quirky, funky kind of sound. The single did become very popular in the Detroit underground scene as well, for some reason, and you know, the band themselves were baffled by it. Detroit producer and DJ Derek May talks about how when he first heard this, he thought it was incredibly funky. And he said, Derek May talks about how when he first received Get the Balance Right, it was a white label, just a vinyl with a white label, no picture, no promotional stuff, just a plain white label. And so, which means he based the song basically on what he heard, and he really thought it was a really, really funky song. And interesting, as I say, the band are quite baffled by the fact that this song became such a massive cult record in the Detroit underground scene. So with Get the Balance Right now done and dusted, it was time for Depeche Mode to get into the studio with Alan Wilder now officially as the fourth member, and they went into the studio, which was the Garden in London, to produce Construction Time Again. Right, let's have a look at some of the gear that was used in the production of Construction Time Again. Now, up until this point, they had the first album, Speak and Spell, which was very keyboard synthesizer-y, and I talked about that album being very honest. It was basically just drum, bass, melody, and sequence. You know, there weren't any atmospheric sounds. Second album comes in, Martin Gore takes the reins, and a more moody sound, more sort of, some might say somber, somewhat odd sound, a very unique sound, and that's thanks to Martin Gore's songwriting. Then of course we get to Construction Time Again. This is where sampling became almost at the forefront of the agenda. But what I loved about Depeche Mode, and as far as sampling is concerned, remember when synthesizers came out, when sampling came out, there were a lot of these avant-garde type artists, off the wall, very arty-farty. Depeche Mode gave us, and I think this was part of their success, Depeche Mode gave us great songs with great production, but also using very odd, out there type sounds. In other words, Depeche Mode presented the pop song in a way you'd never heard it before. You know, with Kraftwerk coming out with their "The Are Dear Robots," you know, all that technology. you know, with their makeup and dressed like mannequins. It was really odd, but it worked. It was great, but of course it wasn't everyone's cup of tea. And then of course you had all the other experimental ones. But then Depeche Mode come along, and you looked at them. They were fresh-faced, sweet-looking, handsome young lads. The girls liked them, and they looked like the guys that if you were a young girl, you could bring them home, and you know, your mum would go, "Oh, he's nice." You know, if you're a young lady, bring Dave Garn home, or Fletch, Martin, or you know, Alan, and your mum would go, "Oh, good choice," because they look really fresh-faced and sweet. And I think this is with Construction Time Again. They were really conscious of the fact that they were perceived as this sort of lightweight kind of pop act. And what was interesting was when you listen to Construction Time Again, as Daniel Miller talked about them wanting to go for a really harder type of sound. And this is, of course, where sampling and everything came in. And Gareth Jones was drafted in to be the engineer. And Gareth Jones was, as he said, reluctant to work with them because, as Gareth Jones said, you know, if anything was on the radio, I don't think he was interested. He was pretty much focused on, I suppose, what someone called the underground. But it was actually John Fox, who was actually a friend and one of Gareth Jones's personal mentors, that actually had to sit down with Gareth and said, "Look, Gareth, you know, they're a good band. They've worked with, you know, obviously they work with Daniel Miller. Daniel Miller obviously received a lot of critical acclaim for his release of Warm Leatherette, which was very off-the-wall, iconic and groundbreaking at the time. And if you listen to it now, it still sounds really sophisticated and brilliant, really. Once again, as legend has it, it's the right combination where the right people come together at the right time, the right songs, writing about the right subject matter, the right engineer, and it's like all the stars lined up and we got Construction Time Again. So sampling really was in the forefront, and experimentation was really the key in this album. And let's look at some of the keyboards. There was the EMU Emulator 1. I've personally never had the privilege of actually seeing one of these or playing one of these. Apparently the emulators just have a sound that cannot be replicated. Also on the kick list were the Korg Mono Poly, the New England Digital Synclavier 2, Oberheim OB8. Once again, we see the PPG Wave 2.2, Roland Jupiter 8, RSF Cabal Expander, the Tiesco 110F, the Yamaha DX7. The drum machines were the EMU Drumulator and once again the TR-808. And although a lot of the gear that Depeche Mode used were being used by other acts as well, I told you in a previous video how Daniel Miller said in a Sound and Sound interview, for example, when they were using a TR-808, they were very conscious not to use the samples straight from the module because a lot of people were doing that. And remember, Depeche Mode's philosophy was never sound like anyone else. The emphasis was always on how can we make this different? How can we stand out? And I really feel they really intentionally pushed the envelope of sounds, and that combined with Martin Gore's unusual songwriting is what's always given Depeche Mode an edge. It's very interesting when you see a lot of acts out there, you know, we call them Depeche Mode clones, or for a lack of a better word, and you get these people that try and do this odd music, but it's kind of like it's odd, but it's like forced odd. I always find Martin Gore's songwriting to be kind of naturally odd, in a good way. It's kind of strange, but it's not like he's trying to be strange. It's just the way he thinks and he expresses himself, and he's not trying to be weird. He just is weird. You know, he's not weird. That's just the way he writes. And I think although some people have accused Depeche Mode of being pretentious, I completely disagree. I sincerely think that Martin just writes and thinks in a certain way. And of course, Alan's interpretations of those songs. Just bear in mind, Alan was very, very key in the development of their sound. That combination between Gore and Wilder really kind of shaped, you know, Martin's songs and Wilder's musical input and sort of overseeing the musical arrangements. Other instruments were the Hohner Melodica, and I always thought the melodica was a little bit of a gimmick. But it was, you know, it's quite sweet. I think back in those days, you know, he'd pick it up and play it at the microphone. You go, oh, he's playing a different type of instrument. So it wasn't necessary, but, you know, once again, it added to the sort of, I suppose, the richness and the visualness of the show, I suppose. Is there a word called visualness? Visual, there is now. On top of that list, there were other things like the solid state Logic SL4000G, Sony Pro Walkman, Stellavox SP7, Tascam Porta Studio 244. But I really just wanted to highlight the keyboards and synthesizers and sort of main production tools they used. Coming on to the vocals, as I talked about on, I think when I said on A Broken Frame, I think I talked about Dave's vocals not being brilliant. I didn't say they were bad, I just said they weren't brilliant. Martin's vocals on A Brilliant Frame, A Brilliant Frame? Yeah. Martin's vocals on A Broken Frame were brilliant. So in this album, we really hear the Dave Gahan that we all love, and he really sort of came into himself. It's like he found himself within this. All the pieces really came together, and I think later on Martin did say that Black Celebration indeed was the album where he felt that once they did Black Celebration, after that every album had like a thread running through them to him. So I think in the words of Martin Gore, Black Celebration was kind of like the album where they went, okay, now we've really found ourselves. But certainly from this album, this was kind of like the, I always like to refer this as the beginning of the Gareth Jones trilogy, you know, Construction Time Again, Some Great Reward, and Black Celebration. This really was the start of where they found themselves. Dave's vocals, very good. Love in Itself, There Was a Time, More Than a Party. You can really hear Dave's sort of baritone voice developing more. So Dave has really sort of started to find himself on this record. There was a time. He has that like round baritone voice that he's well known for, which he doesn't sound like anymore. And I do want to do a video on Dave Gahan and talk speak about how his voice has changed. But the voice he had here was very similar to the voice he had up until, let's say, Violator. But of course, as the albums progressed, his voice got more rich and it just got better. But very good vocals on this from Dave. I don't have any complaints. I think he did a great job. A lot of enthusiasm, a lot of passion, and yeah, very stylistic. He really found his style on this album. Martin Gore as well, as I say, Dave and Martin's voices in combination with the instrumentation and the sound of Depeche Mode are iconic. You can't have one without the other. But yes, Martin sings one solo song on this album, and I think after this, he usually, in typical Depeche Mode style, Martin usually has his spotlight where he sings 2 songs on an album. But indeed on this album, all he did was Pipeline, and Pipeline was brilliant. It's not necessarily a brilliant song, but as some people in my Facebook group are having a debate about it not being a good song, and I had to jump in and say, guys, Pipeline was never based on its melodic structure or chord progression. It was a song about innovation. We'll get into Pipeline a bit further on in this video. To summarize vocals, guys, the vocals on this album I find to be really warm, really sincere, fantastic, really. Right, so let's talk about the sound and the production of Construction Time Again. Daniel Miller did talk about how, it became necessary. They wanted to really go for a harder, sort of more metallic sound. And I think what was good is that this album was really focused in that they all knew what they wanted. Alan Wilder talks about, or metaphorically speaking, and I'm going to paraphrase what he said, something about a broken frame being symbolic with, Vince Clarke leaving and it's broken, the broken frame. And then, of course, the symbolism, whether they meant that at the time or not, of Construction Time Again meant, rebuilding and starting fresh again. And this was really the 4 members. As I said, Alan was now an official member of the band, coming in and going in with brilliant songs, with the enthusiasm of not only presenting those songs in the best way possible, but also trying to present them in a way that no one had ever heard music before. And coming back to what I said earlier, was what gave Depeche Mode such edge was they were these fresh-faced, good-looking young men, but they had this really hard sound. So I think very often if you had just listened to the music and then you had seen them, you'd go, oh, they don't look like the kind of people who would make that music. Because this album's quite dark, actually, if you look at songs, and we'll go into the songs in detail. But if you think of songs like More Than a Party, dun 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 dun, it's very erratic and it's very dark and edgy. Pipeline's another dark song. Told You So is really creepy and eerie, and this is a very, very mature album. And what's interesting is, as I get older as well, I have to look at these albums and go, God, they were in their early 20s when they did this. And when you look back at it, if you look back at it through that lens and you realize how mature and grown up sounding this is, considering they were, just young men, it is a really, really, this is something they could really, really be proud of. And with this album review series, I'm listening to these albums again with fresh ears, and I'm really hearing things in them that I never heard before, and just appreciating them in such a deeper way. Daniel Miller said in an interview that he and the band felt that they were definitely pushing the boundaries and the frontiers of sound. Daniel went on to say, it's not just the sound, but all about the context and how you use them. And no pop band had done this up until this stage, because as I said, you've got really experimental avant-garde, off-the-wall, underground, experimental electronic artists. And then you got these sort of the mainstream pop synthesizer acts. But Depeche Mode were mainstream at this point, but they incorporated a really grown-up, hard, edgy sound in a way that no one had ever approached it before. And that is why, and this is how they became the pioneers of the genre. This album spawned the sort of beginning of the Depeche Mode that we know today. This was really where it started. Although some of I believe that the seed was planted in a broken frame, this really was the beginning of the Depeche Mode that we know and love today. Alan Wilder also talks about how he had just sort of managed to make the transition from being a session muso to band member, and then I think he felt he wanted to contribute a few songs. And Alan said he did talk about how he felt like an outsider for many years after this. Still, I think it was the three boys from Basildon, and Alan was always, he was classically trained. I think he was a year older than them as well, and he was from a very different type of background. I think Alan was a lot more of a middle class background, and so Alan Wilder was very conscious of the fact that he was now part of the band, but he was still the new boy, and he didn't really want to push his agenda. However, he did feel that he had some very good ideas to contribute to the band, not necessarily musical ideas, but in the case of this album, he contributed 2 songs, which were The Landscape is Changing and 2 Minute Warning, which I feel are very, very good songs. And by Alan Wilder's own admission, he said he's not a songwriter, he's a sort of like an architect of soundscapes and production, as he says. But, as I said before, the songs that Alan Wilder contributed to Depeche Mode, I really like, and I know a lot of fans do too. So the sound on this is very metallic, it's very hard hitting, and they talked about at the time, this was the time where they would go into industrial sites, and this mainly in industrial sites in Shoreditch in London. And okay, Shoreditch in London now is very trendy, but it was a lot different in those days. It was almost like a building site in those days. It was very rough and dingy in a way. I'll tell you what, guys, here's an idea. Why don't I take my camera and head down to Shoreditch one day, and I will film the area or the vicinity where Depeche Mode made this album, bearing in mind that Shoreditch has changed a lot in the last, 30 odd years. But back in those days, as I say, it was very sort of like industrial and a little bit run down. So Gareth Jones talks how they would walk around with, he had a Stellavox battery-operated reel-to-reel tape recorder, and they would go down to the industrial sites in Shoreditch with sticks and hammers and anything they could hit, bash, and get a sound from, they would record and sample and bring it back to the studio. This was a really exciting time, guys. Imagine how great it must have been in that time to be one of the forerunners. No one else had done this, and walking around with pieces of metal and bashing and hitting random pieces of metal, recording them, and then taking those sounds back to a studio, loading them into a sampler, and then mapping them on a keyboard so that they make sense musically, using sounds like natural organic sounds to make music, as opposed to using synthesizer generated sounds. They'd slam a door, and that could be added to a snare, or could form the basis of a snare. There were so many creative things they did. I remember seeing Martin Gore taking a pebble and rolling it across on a piece of rail on the balcony, and then they recorded that. They used to record fireworks going off, I think, in Stripped, which we'll talk about in a later album. But yeah, they were very, very experimental, and they could just walk around and say, oh, I'm going to hit that. Fletch, put down that sledgehammer. Fletch, put down the sledgehammer. Fletch, put it down, mate.
Yeah, I'm going to just take this banana and see what sound it makes.
The importance of Gareth Jones to the success and the sound of Depeche Mode cannot be understated. As I say, he was reluctant to work with them in the beginning. John Fox said, listen, work with them. Daniel Miller's done some great stuff. They're enthusiastic. They want to work with you. Go and meet them. And I think Gareth Jones was glad he did, because the band also talked about how Gareth brought a tremendous amount of energy and enthusiasm to the studio and to the whole project. And I believe, from what I've heard, Gareth Jones is a very excited, a very passionate, a very hyperactive kind of producer, and which is great, because I mean, if you're a musician or a producer, how many times do you go into a studio and there's an engineer who's like, oh, yeah, just stick it in there. Yeah. Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. You get those types of engineers, and we know them, but Gareth Jones was really enthusiastic and, okay, let's try this and let's try this. And one of the iconic things about how Gareth Jones established this sound was using acoustic spaces. And Gareth Jones was fascinated by how you could record the space within a space, or the space within a building, and get the natural reverbs and harness that and record that and let that become a part of the sound. So Gareth Jones's approach was really groundbreaking. Unlike the traditional approach of you plug a synthesizer into a recording device, tape or hard disk recorder, whatever they used at the time, and you record the sound, and now you've got the raw sound, and now you add reverb, delay, and effect to it. He did not do that. He had a very, very clever, out-the-box, forward-thinking way of doing it. So what Gareth would do was they would plug their synthesizers into amplifiers and, play through large speakers. And then, so what you're doing is you're playing the keyboard, the sound is going into the amplifier, coming out these huge speakers, and there would be microphones, and they'd be recording the sound of the room. So you're not just getting this isolated sound from a synthesizer going straight onto tape and then affecting it in post-production. You're actually recording the sound of the room live. And this is what gave the sound such a distinct sound, is because by doing it that way, you're not only getting the sound of the synthesizer, but you're getting the sound of the synthesizer and the room. So you've kind of got to set it up properly in the first place, because if you don't like the sound that you've recorded, in other words, if you don't like the sound of the echo or the ambience of the room, you'd have to go back and do it again, because what's on tape is the effect and everything. And if you're a producer, you'll understand what I'm saying. And Gareth Jones was the ideal engineer at the time, because Daniel, along with Depeche Mode, had this out-the-box, forward-thinking, different way of doing things. And Gareth Jones was completely out-the-box and forward-thinking. So it's no wonder this album and the two that came after this was so iconic and so well produced.